Thank you. All right. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Friday EMS National Online News Briefing. Today's briefing is on women of color and how they will vote this November. AAPI women, Black women, and Latinx women voters represent a powerful voting bloc, yet they feel like they are often ignored by policymakers who are not prioritizing the issues that matter to them, according to the results of a new poll, which was released yesterday by Intersections of Our Lives, a collective of 3 leading women of color led reproductive justice organizations. This week, a panel of experts will discuss the poll's findings, explore the front burner issues for women of color voters, and discuss how candidates can effectively engage this critical voting bloc. And we are so honored to have this very esteemed panel. Sang-Young Choimorrow, Executive Director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. Dr. Regina Davis-Moss, President and CEO of In Our Voice, the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Lupe Rodriguez, Executive Director, National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. Celinda Lake, President of Lake Research Partners, and Roshni Nedungadi, Chief Research Officer and founding partner at HIT Strategies. Today's briefing is interpreted in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. We will send a recording of the session to all participants this afternoon. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please do enter them in the chat, and we will take questions after each speaker for about 5 minutes. So let's begin. We start with Sang-Young Choimorrow, who will briefly provide some context for today's briefing, and then we will return to her at the end of the call for data specific to AAPI women. Welcome back, Sang-Young.
Thank you so much, Sunita. It's so good to see you and Sandy, and I see other familiar names popping up in the Zoom room. So thank you so much, y'all, for making time for us and for your interest in this really important work that we're doing. We are here together as what we named Intersections of Our Lives. It's a collaborative project that's made up of the 3 organizations that Sunita just introduced. So with our partners in Our Own Voice and Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, Intersections of Our Lives focuses on addressing civil rights, justice, reproductive health, and equity issues driven by the intersectional experiences of women of color. We're here today because Intersections of Our Lives has released new national polling data that reveals the connections between women of color voters and their priorities heading into this year's election. And our poll found that the connections among Asian American and Pacific Islander, Black and Latina and Latinx women are abundant that we'll highlight here today. We're happy to be joined by our research partners, Lake Research Partners and HIT Strategy, who worked with us to collect the data, do the analysis, and helped ensure that the voices and priorities of women of color voters are able to be shared with you all today. So thank you for attending, as we'll be leaning on you to help us share these important findings with our communities across the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Celinda Lakes and Roshni from our research partners to talk about the polling.
Thank you so much. And it is such a great honor to be in front of you, and some of these relationships we've had for a long time. So it's great to be working with you since we were in kindergarten. And I want to praise Intersections. It's just an amazing principled alliance, visionary, put the resources behind the vision, will say the emperor has no clothes and won't accept no for an answer. It's been such a privilege. and honor to work with them on this important research. We love working with HIT strategies, and Roshni is my absolute favorite. Don't tell the rest of your colleagues, Roshni, over there. So it's really an honor to work with them. And then I want to acknowledge our own team, which was quite big, but headed by Kate Gormley and Alicia Snow. So I can't speak to how, one, exciting this data is, how unique it is. There's no other data set out there like this. And it's expensive to do this kind of research. No one envisions it like this. No one brings these unheard voices to the table. And you are such an important resource in that regard, taking them from the polling briefings to the public. It's very, very rare. In terms of the methodology, we polled from March 14th to April 2nd. This was a national mixed mode survey. 850 Black women registered voters, 850 Latina women registered voters, 850 Asian American Pacific Islander registered voters. Done mixed mode, as I said. There were oversamples within communities. So we have an enormous amount of diversity in terms of being able, because frankly, it's absurd to say, well, the AAPI community, like, are you kidding me? Like, which of the 10 groups? What are you talking about? Well, this is the first survey that actually has those 10 groups, and also invest the money and the care in doing translate. We did translated interviews with them in Mandarin, Korean, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So at every turn, and including Latina Caribbean women, every turn, this data was spectacular. And then we did women of color in 4 key states. We're not going to emphasize that today, but Florida, Georgia, Texas, and Virginia, where these women's voices will make a key difference. So what we're going to lean into is what is different, what is important, what is the polling of women of color together, why it's what's different from white women. And then we're going to talk about, there are lots of similarities, there are lots of differences. Frankly, there are lots of answers to questions that nobody else, literally nobody else, has answers to, because the census doesn't ask these questions and other surveys don't invest in these questions and these voices.
Celinda, may I interrupt you for a second just to ask, what are the questions that you asked that are unique to this poll?
Well, the audience is unique, and you're about to hear about those questions. So, Sunita, great question. And I'll do the first ones, and Roshni's going to cover the bulk of it. So, women of color think things have gotten worse in the country over the past year. 57% of Latinx women think that, 55% of AAPI, 49% of Black women. Voter motivation in the election cycle is low for the entire electorate. Women of color show high potential. And this is where the analysis out there is completely flawed. Yes, motivation is down, but the potential among women of color is enormous, and to vote in higher numbers. If they see change, if they see their values represented, and if they see the policies that matter in their lives, they're very focused on things that impact their lives directly. And if they see policymakers and politicians speak to and address the issues they really care about. So let's talk some more about those issues and those values, and I'll turn it over to Roshni for the rest of the story.
Thanks so much, Celinda. And thank you to the Intersections team. I just want to echo everything that Celinda said about the fantastic research that we got to do here because of the great investment that the team made. By way of introduction, my name is Roshni. I'm a founding partner and chief research officer at HIT Strategies. We're a small market research firm and primarily focused on communities of color, young voters, LGBTQ voters, mostly marginalized communities. So working on this project was really a delight. And like Celinda said, the oversamples and actually accurate sampling that we were able to do in these communities among women of color is not an investment that we see, even though this is an area that we specialize in with many of our clients. So let me jump into some of the specifics from the poll, noting that our speakers later on are going to talk more about the poll and the findings that they're going to expand on within their communities. So some high level takeaways here. We asked what issues are going to determine women of color's votes for president, Congress, and other offices. Rising costs were really one of the most important issues that's determining their votes in the 2024 elections. And we're seeing this across the board. In public polling and private polling, the economy is jumping out as one of the main concerns for people of color. We narrowed it down here really specifically to rising costs for women of color. That's going to be a major driver for the 2024 elections. 35% of Latina women, 33% of AAPI women, and 29% of Black women said that rising cost was one of their most important issues. Women of color clearly told us again about rising costs and concerns about the economy, and we have a sense of what they mean when we dig into that a little bit. It's not just costs when they go to the grocery store, but they're thinking about things like ensuring access to affordable health care, including abortion and birth control. They're thinking about fair housing. They're thinking, of course, about cost of living and closing the pay gap. These rising costs and prices, like I said, are top voting issues, and job creation is also an economic priority across the board. 92% of Black women, 89% of AAPI women, and 88% of Latina women prioritize the creation of good paying jobs. The need for more affordable housing, like I said, also remains a critical concern. 90% of Black women, 82% of AAPI women, and 83% of Latina women stressing the need for more affordable housing options. We also found very clearly that AAPI, Black, and Latina women strongly support abortion care, and they really do care about communities being able to find and afford abortion care. And you're going to hear more about that from all of our speakers coming up. So those were our big headlines and takeaways. I believe that we're leaving a little bit of space for questions now, specifically about the poll and these top lines, and then the other speakers are going to dive more into community-specific areas that we highlight in the poll.
And I think we were particularly interested in questions that if something was confusing or about the methodology, because we still have about half the results to present, but we wanted to pause and make sure that we table set so that everybody understood what we did.
Yeah, there are some questions. Henrietta, do you want to ask a question? Henrietta Burrows.
Yes, thanks so much, Sunita. You talked about some of the questions just now. How was the poll conducted, and what was the margin of error?
Yeah, really good question. So the poll was conducted mixed mode. So everywhere we had people online, we had text online, we had phone. And we repeatedly tried to reach people. In terms of the margin of error, it depends a lot. The margin of error on the overall poll, because we had almost 4,000 interviews, is minuscule. It's like 2%. But by subgroups, it's about 3.5%. So it depends a little on the subgroup that you're looking at, but I would store it as plus or minus 3.5%.
Thank you. Anjana Nagarajan Bhutani from India Currents has the next question.
Hi, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I was wondering if you have any aggregated data, disaggregated data on South Asians and how they polled.
We definitely do, and they're about to get into it. So I'll leave that for the next speakers.
Absolutely. This year is a unique year in which foreign policy seems to be so much in question. And I wonder if the poll did ask about foreign policy issues and how they are going to factor into how women vote this year.
Roshni, shall I hand that off to you since you dealt with the most important problem?
Sure. We did not dig into any issues on foreign policy in this poll specifically. So just prefacing with that, We talked mostly about domestic policy, and like I said, we've been seeing rising costs really rise to the top, not only in this poll, but in other work that we do in these communities. And I think that that's just like a huge priority for these voters thinking about 2024.
One thing
Yeah.
I would add in terms of foreign policy too, and Roshni, tell me if you disagree, values were front and center for these women. They really want their values represented. And a lot of the foreign policy issues that get talked about as issue of the day, that's not how voters are really processing them. They're processing them more as the great reveal on the character of their candidates and the values of their candidates. So Roshni's exactly right that we did not probe in depth at foreign policy concerns, but I would say that really, really important to understand that in some of the choices people were making about and saying they want change, they want values, they want issues that affect them, they were coming in through those prisms.
Thank you. Pilar Marrero has an interesting question. Pilar.
Hi everyone. Are you going to get into differences between the topics of importance between women of color and white women? Because you just made a very, very good point about what is an economic issue. It's not just economy and all that. It's healthcare. Other things.
We are.
Okay, cool.
And what about the rise in hate crimes, which is so prolific within the AAPI community? I mean, it's been an issue for many years. We see an increased visibility of that over the past 4 years. Was there any data on that?
There was data more on violence, which is, of course, related to hate crimes. And the violence was strongest in the Black community, but it was very, very strong in AAPI. And we have done, I think, Roshni, you've done it too. We have done work in other realms where we have seen, like we did some work in Virginia, and we saw this issue really rise in our Virginia subset. So your assessment is actually absolutely right. And we have data that approaches it broadly. And then we asked, address anti-Asian American Pacific Islander hate-related violence. Actually, what was interesting is everybody wanted it addressed, and African Americans were quite strong on it. But as you would not be surprised, AAPI, the strongest on it. And it was at 49%, about 9 points under the top issues for them, but still very strong.
Yeah, if you wanted to draw conclusions from your results, would you say that women of color believe that the current Biden administration is handling their concerns effectively?
Well, I think they would say that, and in some ways, Sungyeon, this is more in your bailiwick and the principal's bailiwick, but I will say this. We didn't really explore one administration or another. I think these women, and they make it very clear, they don't think that anyone is listening enough to them. It's not specific to one administration or one elected official. They think they're not being represented, their values are not being represented enough. There's not enough change that affects them and their families, and their policies that affect their everyday lives are not being implemented. So this is a universal concern, not specific to one individual.
Interesting. Before we move on to Dr. Regina Davis-Moss, I wanted to ask you, Celinda, and you, Roshni, how do candidates effectively engage with this voting bloc, which is so powerful?
That's a great question. And I think the first step is communicating with them, particularly on the issues that they care about. I think frequently these communities have been overlooked as reliable voting blocs. And so it's not necessary to connect with them and communicate and talk to them or even find out what is an important priority for them. But these women are really looking for that communication and for the reassurance that elected officials are thinking about their agendas and advocating for them.
Fantastic. Celinda, any final remarks?
I think Roshni said it best. And I want to leave lots of time for the other comments.
All right, super. So we're going to move on to Dr. Regina Davis Moss, the president and CEO of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Welcome, Dr. Davis Moss.
Thank you. And it's so great to be here. You know, I really want to get into it. There seems to be a lot of interest in the nuances of the poll. And so I want to get into this really quickly, but also save some time for my colleagues so we can answer some of those questions. You know, we need to really say up front that a lot of the reasons, a lot of the policies, a lot of the concerns we have related to not being seen or heard are related to institutional racism. And we touched on this in our polls, and there's real deep and broad agreement among women of color that racism has gone on for far too long. When we asked that question, 79% of Black women, 62% of Latina women, and 61% of AAPI women strongly agree with that statement. And then when we ask if it's time for leaders to create and fight for systems of racial justice, and if that has been, you know, long overdue in terms of creating those systems, there's even more agreement. And so what that's really saying is that, you know, it's a recognition that we need leaders to own. We need them to clearly understand that, and that we need them to address those issues that impact our you know, experiences in daily lives. So, you know, I want to just reiterate, you know, reproductive justice is the right to decide if, when, and how to have a child, and then the right to parent that child in safe, sustainable, and supportive communities. And that's directly tied to systemic racism. And that's at the core of what we do, and that's the core of Intersections and Mission. So those priorities that we're talking about, those policies, those issues that we need to do that reflect that, they are rooted in, you know, if there's a preconceived notion about a racial group, that's going to result in less resources to us, substandard care, less housing and employment or educational opportunities. That's how it's going to show up. And so that's why we see these inequities. That's why we're seeing these high maternal mortality rates that are particularly important to Black women. You know, we talked about this, you know, and there's a research with regard to in the lead up to Dobbs that said, you know, those abortion bans, they're going to have an impact on maternal mortality rates. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing that concern. A solid majority of women of color, especially 91% of Black women, believe it's important for Congress to address the high rates of maternal death among women of color. 66% of, so 79% of AAPI women and 74% of Latina women also believe it's important. And so, you know, I guess the key thing that I want to leave you all with is that there's going to be a need to name and address systemic racism. We want to hear politicians, policymakers leaning into that. It's going to be critical to them if they want to earn our votes.
Thank you. Black voters, I'll start with questions. Black voters have traditionally been a reliable Democratic voting bloc. Could you talk a little bit about that and whether you expect to see that reliable voting bloc in 2024?
I'm glad you said that. You know, Black women in particular are some of the most committed voters, some of the most decisive voters. We absolutely expect that. You know, that's true for all women of color. You know, 9 out of 10 women of color have said that voting is very important. That which says to me is that we know our votes matter, but we also are pushing back and saying, you know, the onus is not on us to just turn out all the time. Don't take us for granted. The onus is on you to demonstrate that you understand what we need and to speak to our needs.
Absolutely. And just to follow up, are candidates reaching out to Black women voters, or as I asked earlier, are they just assuming that they will show up? Are there specific reach outs to them?
I mean, there's outreach this is an election year. Let's not pretend. So there's outreach to all the key constituencies. But the point is that what I'm going to keep reiterating is, we're at this point now where we are going to hold them accountable. You're not going to just be able to continue to rely on our vote to know, we know very clearly that we carry a lot of these elections on our back. But at this point, it's, what are you going to do? There was a politician that said, okay, so, you got me. I'm summarizing this not well, but essentially what he said is, now that I'm in office, now make me do it. And so we're going to make you do it.
That's fantastic. We have a number of questions for you. Let's start out with Raymond Tyler. Raymond, would you please identify your news organization and ask your question?
Sure. How you doing? My name is Raymond Tyler. I'm the civic engagement producer and editor for AtlanticCityFocus.com. I have a number of questions, but I guess I'll ask this one because this is the one that's pressing me the most. Do you have any data of how the women voters of color feel on these issues between the ages of 35 and over, and then 35 and under? And the reason I ask, because it's been my experience that most of the time older Black voters seem less interested in holding the people they vote for accountable.
That's a great question.
I don't know if did I say that? Did I express that clearly enough?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you
we don't have any
expressed it
data
clearly.
I'm sorry, Celinda, if you want to take that.
No, please, Dr. Musk.
We don't have any data on that per se. I mean, I would say anecdotally from conversations that I've had in our civic engagement work, is that actually older voters, both male and female, understand the power of their vote. They're very clear about their ancestors fought and died for this right to vote. And so they do not take that lightly. The same actually for younger voters, in that they understand that their vote is important, but they're real concerns. Younger voters are concerned about things like the economy, and things we lifted up, affordable housing. And so what it really is to me is that we need to continue to have conversations so that people know that their voices, their issues, their concerns are being heard. That really goes a long way in terms of ensuring that we're going to show up, is to know that you've heard me. There's going to be redress, there's transparency, and there's going to be a real effort to address these things that I've talked about.
Absolutely. We go back to Henrietta Burrows for another question. Henrietta.
Yes, thanks, Sunita. One of my questions was about domestic violence. We mentioned hate crimes, and it seems that domestic violence cuts across all racial lines and is certainly affecting women of color. So I'd like to know if there was a question about domestic violence as a concern. And also, since I have another question, do you see any alliances between women of color and white women voters?
Is that to me, or is that to
Yes, that is
anybody?
This is your time.
The pollsters. I'm going to punt that one to the pollsters in terms of was domestic violence a variable in terms of the issues of concern? But I mean, to the latter question, there's absolutely solidarity in terms of all women really understanding the power of our vote and being collective, and knowing that when we come together, we are going to ensure that we have people in office that are going to reflect our values.
Roshni, do you want to take the first stab?
Go ahead.
So I would say one of the things you see in the data that's really, really strong is the alliance. There's this massive assumption, which the intersection data just blew asunder, that women of color are so different, they don't agree on the things, etc. There was remarkable agreement on the big picture and agreement on the small picture. So that was very, 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 very strong. And I think the data shows it as well. as the tremendous on the ground experience that people are bringing to the table. We couldn't answer every issue, but there are, I think and Sung Young, I would defer to you here. The reproductive justice agenda, as it's been defined by intersections for decades and been insisted upon to be looked at through that bigger prism, has always, it's felt like to me, included strong emphasis on violence and domestic violence, etc. So, and certainly women of color are very, very strongly engaged on the broad reproductive justice agenda, including access, affordability. For this is one of the differences with white women. White women are less focused on the economics of it. Women of color think this is one and the same. You can't have access without affordability. So that's actually one of the biggest and important differences. But I think the agenda has always been quite strong. The other thing I would say is, you know, on the previous question about accountability among older African-American women, I think older African-American women, and we see this in focus groups we've done, and Roshni, you should jump in here, they're fed up. They're ready to hold people accountable. And so we see some generational differences in the data for sure, but less than you would think.
Yeah, I would just add on to that question of accountability. We do a lot of work on segmenting the Black electorate, and we find that a lot of times our older Black voters are in this kind of legacy civil rights group that we find are reliable voters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing is not holding elected officials accountable. They really believe that the way to hold elected officials accountable is to vote every time and vote on their priorities and vote for candidates who they believe represent their priorities. So I think it's a different way of generations looking at accountability for elected officials.
Absolutely.
And I'll jump in here to answer the question about gender-based violence. I mean, it was going to come later on in the presentation, but we kind of thought this might happen where, you know, we're not doing the whole presentation up front and then getting questions. So, you know, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole. But actually, so women's rights and abortion combined was the top issue across the board for women of color. So when we talk about women's rights, that includes, you know, issues such as gender-based violence, discrimination based on gender, and earning of a fair wage, like gender wage gap, right? So that's included. And so as Celinda mentioned, you know, we see a very close tie between economic mobility and access and abortion, not just rights, but access as a top priority, folks. So those two combined actually, you know, are tied for first place in terms of top issues that voters are thinking about, with rising costs, right? Which to me says a lot, because I don't know a person who's like not shocked at paying $6 for a dozen eggs these days, right? So the fact that women of color care this much about abortion access and women's rights in the context of gender-based, gender-related issues, I think is pretty significant.
Fantastic. We have two more questions before we move on to Ms. Rodriguez. Celinda, does anything for you stand out as new among women of color today versus 20 years ago? How impactful is the surge of anti-immigrant sentiment, for example?
Well, I would separate the two questions that you're asking about. But yes, several things stand out to me. Well, first of all, it wasn't like we had good representation of these voices 20 years ago. Right. So quite frankly, the revolutionary aspect of intersections data, and they were involved in this 2 years ago too, it remains game changing in my opinion. You can't respond to what you don't know about. Now, it's inexcusable that our elected officials don't know about this, but we're going to help them by providing the information. The second thing that really strikes me is the pessimism. 20 years ago, people of color were a lot more optimistic. 20 years ago, everybody was a lot more optimistic. But this is deeply penetrating into communities that are advancing quite fast, working quite hard, really trying to make a change for their families and their communities. People want to combine voting with other activities, but they still see voting as a central way of implementing change. That was true 20 years ago, but there's a lot of conventional wisdom that says it wouldn't be true today. One of the things I love about conventional wisdom is it's usually 95% wrong, plus or minus 5%. And that's certainly true in this data. This data has a ton of mythbusters in it. And then the last thing I would say that really stood out to me, and I'd love Roshni to answer this question too. One of the things that's so different from 20 years ago is so many things are not different from 20 years ago. We need to hurry history here. We should have made more progress. We should not be looking at taking away rights. And, you know, the number one issue was any discrimination against people because of race, ethnicity, and culture. People firmly believe that racism had gone on too long as an overall umbrella. And so the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's absolutely unacceptable to women of color.
One last question before we, oh, sorry, please, Roshni.
I would just add very quickly, because I know we want to move along with the rest of the speakers, but thinking specifically about young women of color, I feel like often people, to Celinda's point about the kind of cynicism and frustration, people often think that young people, young women particularly, are apathetic towards what's going on or ill-informed about what's going on in this country because of the level of cynicism. And I think due to their engagement with their peers online and access through social media to so much information, it's not apathy or not being informed. It's really just a sense that they want to see elected officials act for change, and they're not seeing that. And so it's a sense of cynicism with the system and not necessarily with like that is them being underinformed or misinformed.
Final question before we move on to Ms. Rodriguez. 2 years ago, after the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, there was a mass movement by women to get effective gun control measures into place. How much will we see gun control in the way women vote in 2024? Is it still a front burner issue?
Yes, it's in the top tier. And I think, Lupe, you may be going to talk about that, but it's very much in the top tier. And gun violence prevention, very, very high with African Americans, very high with Latino voters. Latinas, the third highest issue within margin of error, and tied for the top. People have no idea how energized, particularly as hate crimes have risen, the AAPI community is on gun violence prevention. So yes, if you're going to talk about issues that matter, this is an issue that matters to women of color big time.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to Lupe Rodriguez, who is the Executive Director of National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. Welcome, Lupe.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for this conversation so far. I think much of what I was going to share today has been discussed. So that'll be good. I really wanted to elevate, just some of the top lines again about the data, how the data shows the impact of women of color voters will be in November, their interest in voting, and what drives them. And I think we've said it a number of times, but I'll put a finer point on it. And I'll start by saying, of course, that as we've mentioned, right, like women of color voters can't be underestimated. The message here is that our collective support holds significant sway in determining election outcomes, especially in this era of elections in which victories are often decided by narrow margins. And so, our data presents a really compelling narrative regarding our attitudes and motivations. And I'll reiterate what Celinda said, that voter motivation in this election cycle has been low across the entire electorate. And we've found that that's because of, feelings of folks not seeing the values that are important to them represented in dialogue that's happening in places of power, but also not seeing change. And so, but again, our communities continue to be motivated and continue to be an electorate that needs to be moved and that is of high potential. The data, says that 53% of AAPI women, 57% of Black women, and 60% of Latina and Latinx women are very motivated to vote in this November's elections. Overall, 90% of AAPI women, 86% of Black women, and 87% of Latina and Latinx women are only somewhat motivated or very motivated to vote in November. So, the sort of highly motivated numbers are smaller, but again, folks are still paying attention and somewhat motivated, still thinking about the election. And, women of color, the data shows that women of color perceive voting as crucial for affecting desired changes in the country. So they still see that, along with other actions, of course, civic engagement of other kinds, but they still see voting as a really important activity for affecting change. And so 64% of Latina and Latinx women emphasize its importance, and folks see it as important in again, making change. As mentioned too, nearly 9 in 10 women of color emphasize the importance of voting overall. And so, so they have to be engaged and moved in this election in order for folks to be able to win, or for anybody who's running to be able to win.
Sorry, Lupe, one of the interpreters asked if you could please slow down a little bit, and I apologize in advance for interrupting.
No worries. No worries. Since the majority, as we've discussed, see voting as very effective in creating the change they want, we want to underscore that the experiences and priorities of women of color are not showing up in political or policy discussion. So that's, again, while people see voting as extremely important for affecting change, their motivation numbers are not as high as they have been, right? And so again, that's part of what we're discussing here, that's because of the fact that folks are not seeing their priorities and experiences reflected in change that's happening. So really, the message is that we should not be seen as low propensity voters. We need to be seen as high potential voters. We have the numbers and the interest, and again, the perception of importance in voting to be able to make a difference. And folks can't afford to take us for granted. I think a couple of things I'll just elevate in terms of the Latino community specifically. Latinas and Latinx women in this survey saw or mentioned that things have gotten worse in their community. So 52% of us said that, as well as like the larger picture numbers for all women of color saying that things have gotten worse in the country and have stagnated as well. And so, I think there's a really, there's motivation there to make change around that. But again, folks need to see that they're being talked about, that the issues they care about are being talked about. And then one of the noteworthy findings that my colleague Sanyan is going to talk about next is, and more in depth, is a strong support for abortion rights among women of color. And, I want to elevate Latina and Latinx women specifically because there's often misconceptions and misinformation about Latinas around this issue. 73% were overall in favor of abortion, and and are interested in seeing that as an issue that is talked about, that is addressed. And again, with Latinas and other women of color, we've seen their power as a voting bloc on this issue in recent elections. For example, in Ohio and other states that have put abortion on the ballot, voters of color, and including Latino voters, are rejecting abortion bans and attacks on their freedom. So that's a really important part of this as well. I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer any questions.
And of course, there are a number of questions for you. Let's start with Nancy Tran. Nancy, please identify your news organization.
Hi, I'm sorry. I was clumsy on my mute.
No worries.
Okay, I'm Nancy with Radio TNT Vietnamese language. And my observation is nowadays people are so much voting along the line of their political party affiliation, regardless of the leader or their choice of leader, who is totally against democracy and our long-term interests and the future of the country. So that's the problem, the big problem. Thanks.
Lupe, would you like to take that on?
I wasn't sure that I caught what the question was exactly, but I mean, was it just about folks being partisan in this
Exactly.
moment? Okay.
Yes.
You know,
and how that's going to factor in.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience, in doing this work in different ways, so I think perhaps I can send it over to Roshni or Celinda for the specifics on that particular question. We didn't, create this research or this this study based on any kind of partisan question, but I do know that my experience working with the Latina community, partisan politics are not necessarily what drives people. They are moved by candidates and folks in power who speak to the issues that matter to them, who are respectful, of course, of their communities, who seek to address like everyday issues that they are facing, on things like immigration and family separation, on things like healthcare access. Latina folks continue to be, have the lowest rates of insurance and regular healthcare coverage in this country. They respond to folks who are talking about combating racism and xenophobia against the community, and who, again, because of their support for reproductive rights and for women's health and abortion access and reproductive rights, they have been showing up to support that access and protecting that access. And I think what our study found, maybe something that'll get to this, is that folks are voting based on their values. Folks are voting and moved by candidates and folks that are thinking about the issues that matter to them and making change in those issues. So we didn't see so much that folks were saying one party or another, and we didn't maybe ask that question directly, but when we asked folks like what moves them, those were the things that came up. So values and their issues being addressed.
One more question for you. I know there are a few other questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask about climate change. Did that factor in as a concern for Latina voters?
I don't know that it was top tier necessarily, but there are environmental justice concerns in our experience. A lot of how that connects with folks in the community is often in terms of their lived experience in their neighborhoods, right? Like not having access to clean water, living in places with in high density places that don't have clean air, particularly in places like the Central Valley in California. I know I did a lot of work when I worked there, when I worked here, I should say. On issues that were important to Latina communities in the Central Valley, where there were a lot of problems with clean water and clean air.
Fantastic. Thank you. There are a number of questions in the chat for all of you all, and I hope you all are monitoring the chat to answer questions there, if you wouldn't mind. We're going to circle back to Sangyeon Choimorrow to draw on data specific to AAPI women. Welcome back, Sangyeon.
Thank you. I know there are a number of you that really do speak to our communities and various languages and ethnic groups. So I just want to provide just a couple top lines of our collective poll and then really dig more into the API data. And then also want to say that there's a lot of disaggregated API data that, we can follow up, with documents for you all to take a look at. So just off the top, I just want to just reiterate that, women of color through this polling demonstrated again that like the issues we care about are very similar. Our top issues didn't vary a whole lot. And that really it comes down to our ability to have autonomy and make decisions of our lives in meaningful ways, right? So economic mobility, and bodily autonomy really did rise to the top. And I already made the comment about women of color and abortion, so I'm gonna just skip over that and really dig a little into the AAPI data. So the AAPI women are a crucial voting bloc in 24 elections. We know that in the AAPI community, we know there were a number of elections won 2 years ago and 4 years ago by very slim margins, and in certain places, definitely Asian American voters could have been or had been decisive vote. So 87% of API women are very motivated to vote. 62% are extremely motivated to vote. So these are really, big numbers in terms of what we're seeing in terms of people wanting to come out to vote in November. But also 52% say they're extremely, that vote of 52% say voting is an extremely effective way to create change that they want to see. But they also, this finding speaks to the disillusionment of API women voters feeling that they're not seen in their experiences and priorities addressed by politics or policy. So you see the drop in being motivated to vote versus whether they think is effective or not, right? For API women, top tier priorities that they want politicians to act on include, but obviously not limited to, reforming our criminal justice system, passing gun violence prevention laws, passing paid family medical leave, and ensuring medication abortion available to all women. But mainly, just like in Latina and Latinx women, rising costs also is a major issue that API women care about. And just to respond to the question about disaggregated data, I just wanted to pull a few things. So we conducted this poll to oversample for 5 ethnic groups: Chinese, Filipina, Indian, Korean, and Vietnamese Americans, and those are the most populous ethnic groups in the United States, and that's why we polled those folks. And we, for Koreans and Chinese and Vietnamese, we did do bilingual outreach, right? So we were able to reach people in the language that they were most comfortable in. So while we don't have disaggregated data for South Asian women, we do have data for Indian women. And I'm sure it would not be a big surprise to those of you that are from the community or report in this community, but abortion access rose as a very, very high priority for Indian American women. Most important issues for Indian American women polled include ensuring medication abortion is available to everyone, that everyone has affordable health care, and that ensuring abortion is legal, affordable, and accessible, right? So again, there weren't any other groups where top 3 issues all included some aspect of abortion and abortion access, but that's that we have that for Indian Americans. The next data set, actually, I as a Korean American was a little bit surprised by, right? So again, as Lupe was saying about perceptions about Latinas and their positions on abortion. Similarly, there are perceptions about certain ethnic groups in the API community that are seen as anti-abortion or apolitical. Well, 3/4 of Chinese, 3/4 or more of Chinese and Indian women who were polled said they support abortion access. 7 in 10 Vietnamese and Korean women support abortion care and abortion and access to reproductive health care. That was surprising to me as a Korean. I've always seen that data to be lower, but as you can see, women in general are being more outspoken about their views on these things. And 6 in 10 Filipina women also hold this view, right? So it's safe to say in our data set that more than half, right, of any of our communities, women support folks' access to abortion and legal right to abortion. For Korean American women, the top issue was women's rights. Again, that includes both abortion as well as gender-based issues like wage gap and gender-based violence. Rising costs and prices were top of mind for Chinese, Filipino, and Vietnamese women voters. And then there's some differences in second top issues among certain communities, like Korean American women, second top issues was threat to the democracy. I think somebody alluded to that earlier. And Chinese women and Indian women, second top issues were women's rights, and Filipino women were equally focused on immigration and healthcare and affordable prescription drugs. And for Vietnamese American women, their second highest issue was voting issues, women's rights and threat to democracy. So you see a little bit of a variance there, but I know we're really short on time here, so I'll just, summarize and say that, I think what we want you all to take away to our communities is that, sometimes we're in an echo chamber and only talks amongst ourselves and only know what your auntie or your grandma or your mom or your daughters care about. But, this data that 7 out of 10 Korean American women support abortion access, I am telling every Korean I know, right? Because I think the more of us that are out there talking about it and changing the narrative, the more our community feels like they can participate in that and really change the trajectory of this country and how we think about this very important issue for us. And then, of course, that, anybody running for office needs to listen, right? Every community, all of our communities say that we know what we care about, we know what needs to be fixed, yet we don't feel like people are addressing those issues. So I will wrap it up there.
Well, this has been such a robust conversation, and there's so many more questions for you all. But I would like to end with going back to each of you with your 30-second soundbite for our reporters. What is the most important takeaway that each of you would like our reporters to understand from this very robust conversation? Sang-Yeon, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I would say a headline that pops to my head is activating the powerful bloc of women of color voters. And my soundbite would be our polling underscores that AAPI women voters and our fellow women of color voters are too powerful a force to be ignored during this election season. We are motivated and we are passionate about the issues that impact our lives the most.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lupe Rodriguez.
I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And, our point here is specifically for Latinas, we are voting with our values in this election. And our poll highlights that Latinas are crucial to outcomes in this year's election. We want to see our experiences reflected in politics and policy change. We are concerned about rising costs and access to reproductive health care, and those things are connected.
Fantastic. Dr. Davis-Moss.
Oh, yes. And so thanks again for having me. I would say our headline is Women of Color Voters Want Comprehensive Policy Solutions. Earning the votes of women of color means recognizing that we do not live single issue lives. Reproductive justice is a key priority for Black women and other women of color voters, and it encompasses many aspects of bodily autonomy, such as access to birth control, abortion services, and economic opportunity. And so again, we're underscoring it's not about that one issue, it's all about all of those. And our vote is key to securing equity and justice for all families and generations to come.
Thank you. Roshni, Nedungadi, you're next.
My headline would be Women of Color Vote with Their Values and Advocate for Their Communities. Women of color are frustrated with the state of the country and believe that the upcoming election is important to lift up issues faced by women and communities of color around the country. Women of color are acutely aware that systemic racism continues to negatively impact their lives in ways that they must grapple with day to day. And they're voting with their values, and they're looking to elected officials to speak to those values and on the issues that are important to them.
Thank you. Final word from Celinda Lake.
Oh, thank you. And those were all wonderful sound bites. I would say that women of color represent an enormous potential vote, but we are at a crossroads. They are not going to vote for people unless they see change, they see their values represented, and they see policies talked about to them that affect their daily lives.
Fantastic. Well, this has been such a tremendous and robust conversation. Thank you to all of our speakers.
You for great moderating.
Thank you. Thank you. And reporters, we'll see you next Friday. This conference is closed.